Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this first meeting of the Indiana Bar Foundation Civic Education Task Force. My name is Chuck Dunlap, and I'm currently the Executive Director of the Indiana Bar Foundation. And on behalf of the Bar Foundation, we really want to thank you for taking the time out of your extremely busy schedules to join us for this effort. I especially want to thank Governor Crouch for chairing the task force. As you can imagine, she did not predict that we would all be in the middle of a global pandemic when she accepted this role, and we're extremely grateful to her that she's continued to make this Civic Education Task Force initiative a priority, even with her incredibly busy and challenging schedule. So thank you, Governor Crouch. We'll formally begin the meeting momentarily, and I'll turn it over to Governor Crouch to preside as chair, and we'll start the agenda. But before I do, just a couple housekeeping, general operational issues for the meeting. First, I want to let you know that as you entered the meeting, you were all muted. So you'll have the ability to unmute if you want to ask questions or type in the chat box, which we encourage once we get to that portion, so we can have some interactive participation. But we ask that you keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking, so we can avoid background noise and that sort of thing. For those of you that are in Zoom and using the online feature, the microphone button, and you're probably all experts in Zoom by now anyway, but the bottom left corner, you can toggle that on and off. We're going to be hearing from our speakers shortly, and we will pause to take questions after the speakers have completed their portion to take questions from task force members. So if you're at your computer, you can, at the chat function, type in your questions, and Joseph O'Connor, who you just heard from, will be reading those out loud to everybody, so we can kind of try to do that orderly. And if you're on the phone, we have a few people joining us by phone. When the question time is appropriate, go ahead and just unmute your phone, and you can ask your questions that way. Finally, I'd like to mention that this meeting is being recorded, and it'll be readily available through the Dropbox that we have with all the other information, and all of the other slides, presentations, etc. will be available there, and we'll be making it the video available on our website afterwards. So with that, I think that's all of the preliminary matters I wanted to kind of cover. So Governor Crouch, I will turn it over to you to begin the formal agenda.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you to our Civic Education Task Force members for participating on this call this morning. I'll call the meeting to order, and I would like to note that the task force was established by a recommendation of the 2019 Civic Health Index, and that recommendation stated that to continue to promote civic engagement, we propose convening a civic education task force to study methods of instruction, programs, and educational outcomes to improve civic education opportunities for all ages and prepare specific policy recommendations to improve civic education opportunities and programs in Indiana. So as you all can see, members, it's a pretty broad statement that allows us the opportunity to address multiple issues surrounding civic engagement. The first item on our agenda is Chuck Dunlap, who is the Executive Director of the Indiana Bar Foundation. And Chuck, I just want to thank you for your dedication to the task force, and I will turn it over to you for some background and logistics.
Thank you, Governor Crouch. Appreciate that very much. And as you've just heard, the broad charge for the Civic Education Task Force that came as a result of the 2019 Indiana Civic Health Index, of which the Indiana Bar Foundation was a primary sponsor. The Bar Foundation is dedicated to promoting and advancing civic education and engagement, and that's why we convened Blue Ribbon Task Force to focus on advancing education opportunities for all Hoosiers and develop a set of recommendations and a blueprint for action. It's our goal during the next few months to hear from national experts about a variety of civic education programs and initiatives that are making a real difference in moving the needle to increase people's understanding, appreciation, and participation in civic life through quality and robust civic education. In addition to the national perspective, we'll also be looking at the civic education programs, opportunities, and initiatives that are taking place in local communities throughout Indiana. Some are extremely impressive and inspirational, while some realities demonstrate areas that we can improve on. It's our goal that at the end of this process in November, with your help, we'll produce a report laying out specific, actionable recommendations that are ambitious but also realistic. We strive to increase civic education opportunities for all Hoosiers, which in turn will serve as a catalyst to increase Indiana's overall civic health. This is an ambitious goal with an equally ambitious timeline that wasn't helped by the current coronavirus crisis, but nonetheless, we're confident that we'll be able to achieve our goal. I also want to take this opportunity to give a very special thanks to our partners at the Lumina Foundation, who've provided a generous grant to support the work of this task force. In particular, I want to thank and recognize Tim Robinson, Assistant Vice President of Operations and Grants Administration at the Lumina Foundation. Tim is on the call with us and was introduced earlier, but I just wanted to thank him and Lumina. We literally wouldn't be able to do this without Tim's personal support and the critical support from the Lumina Foundation, which we're so fortunate to have as one of our leading Hoosier corporate citizens. So thank you, Tim, and thank you, Lumina. Now, a few words about some of the logistics for the task force as a whole. As you probably know, in addition to me, Joseph O'Connor will be serving as primary staff support for this project, and Joseph was introduced earlier. And we encourage you to contact us at any time if you have any questions or comments during the course of this process. On our contact information is in the Dropbox folder, along with other material that we're going to post there from this meeting and future meetings as well, and other resources. There are going to be 3 additional meetings of the full task force. The dates, times, and locations are in the updated agenda that we sent out for your reference, so you can hopefully calendar those and join us. During the future meetings, in addition to the next one in Indianapolis in June, we'll have the opportunity to visit Bloomington and Muncie in August and October respectively, where we look forward to being able to hear from local community members about civic education from their perspectives. For those of you that may not be able to attend the meetings in person in the future, and we hope that that's not all of us, that we are able to make some road trips here, we plan on having the meeting participation accessible via teleconference and video as well. So for those of you that aren't able to join, we still would love to have you participate in any way that you can. As you know, this issue is extremely important for our communities, our state, and our nation. And I look forward to making a difference in improving civic education in Indiana and to truly move the needle in improving Indiana's civic health in partnership with each of you over the next few months. I just want to close this section of the agenda with my personal gratitude to every one of you for participating today, and leave us with some inspiring words from a true Hoosier statesman, national treasure, and the epitome of what I think it means to be a public servant, and that's Congressman Lee Hamilton, who I believe is joining us today on this call, and also served as one of the co-chairs of the 2019 Indiana Civic Health Index. Not only has Congressman Hamilton been demonstrating his commitment to civic education and involvement for his entire life and professional career, he's spoken about it a time or two, and much more eloquently than I ever could. So I will reference his September 2003, Ted, this might sound familiar to you, his September 2003 speech from the Congressional Conference on Civic Education. Congressman Hamilton had these words to say that I think sum up very well what we hope to advance during this task force's work. He stated, "We've been bequeathed freedom, justice, and opportunity from the deeds and commitments, even the spilled blood, of Americans who came before us. We did not earn the inheritance. This nation of unequal wealth and power, of freedom and opportunity was given to us. But no matter how rich and powerful it becomes, America is not and never will be a finished project. It's always a borning. You and I are handed a work in progress, one that can evolve for good or for ill. American democracy makes a wager on its citizens. The deal is simple. With freedom comes obligation, with liberty becomes duty. If that deal is not kept, democracy is threatened." Lincoln said at Gettysburg, "It is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced." He spoke of a new birth of freedom so that of, by, and for people would not perish. You and I must learn, and we must teach our young the words we live by, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the other grand documents of American history. And we must learn and teach about the institutions that bring life and permanence to these words and deeds so familiar to us, so that they may fulfill Lincoln's charge. Democracy is not fixed like a monarchy, it is dynamic. Democracy reflects the will and above all the action of each generation of American citizens. So what do we owe? As Americans, we owe a profound debt of gratitude for the actions of those who preceded us, and we owe those who will follow an America that is even greater and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. Thank you, Congressman Hamilton, for those inspiring words. Thank you for being with us today and your continuing commitment to civic education. And with that, I turn it back over to you, Governor Crouch.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you for sharing those inspirational words from Congressman Hamilton. And thank you, Congressman Hamilton, for being on and serving this task force, but also for your many years of service to our state and country. Now, today we're fortunate to have Ted McConnell on the call to provide us with some insight on national civic education and engagement. Ted serves as Senior Policy Advisor to the Civics Now Coalition, which is committed to improving the quality and quantity of civic learning in our nation's schools. Ted has been involved in the political, governmental, and nonprofit sectors for over 40 years and has dedicated most of his work to this very topic. A quick note, if you're on the computer for this meeting, please write your questions for Ted in the chat box. Chuck will be the moderator afterwards. If you are on the phone for this meeting, we will give you notice of when you can ask your questions at the end of Ted's presentation. And with that, Ted, we are happy to hear from you now, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and good morning, Governor Crouch, Justice Shepard, and Congressman Hamilton. It is always great to hear your words, and I'm so delighted you're engaged in this effort. Good morning, friends. On behalf of the National Civic Education community, thank you for what you're doing there in the great state of Indiana in helping to restore the essential civic mission of Indiana's schools. I'm going to take a few minutes and give you a little historical background on the state of civic learning in our country today, talk a little bit about what some other states have done more generally and some recommendations we have developed for states. And then my very good friend and dear colleague, Sean Healy, Dr. Sean Healy of the McCormick Foundation, will go more into depth about other state examples. You know, until the 1960s, early 1970s, 3 distinct civic education courses were common in American high schools, 2 in American middle schools, and the social studies civic learning was woven throughout the elementary school grades. Today, in the vast majority of schools in our country, it's been reduced down to 1 semester, a very dry mechanical course on how our government operates, rather than the how and the why and the essentialness of citizen participation, hearkening back to Congressman Hamilton's words. In fact, in 31 states, they only offer a 1 semester course in civics. In 10 states, there's 2 semesters at high school in civic education. In 9 states, including until recently, thanks to the work of Sean Healy, Illinois, in 9 states currently, there is no requirement that a student take a civic education course in order to graduate. I date the beginning of the decline in civic education to an October night in 1958, when the then Soviet Union launched a little basketball thing into space called Sputnik. And thus began our periodic national panics about how we're not doing well in math and in science, and followed by panics that we're not doing well in reading instruction in our country. Certainly the No Child Left Behind era and Common Core era exacerbated the trend away from effective civic education. The reality in most classrooms today in civic education is instruction comes from a dry textbook produced by Pearson, Houghton Mifflin, one of the big publishers, that doesn't engage student interest. And this has occurred at the same time there has been a revolution in innovation about civic education brought about by the supplemental civic learning community. Programs like the Center for Civic Education's We the People programs that our teachers we're going to hear from here in a little bit, Janet and Molly, teach so effectively there in Indiana and run by the Barr Foundation. Programs like the iCivics program, founded by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, Congressman Hamilton's good partner in restoring civic education. The MICVA Challenge program out of Chicago, which is service learning combined with civic education. These are the type of programs we need to see in every single school. We've also got to reclaim the time and resources that have been taken away from civic learning. You know, a lot of people are going to be scientists. A lot of people are going to go into the medical profession. A lot of people are going to be engineers, needing special training in those areas. But everyone will be a citizen who needs to have and possess civic knowledge, civic skills, and a disposition for participation. So we've seen over the last decade and a half a growing sense among policymakers, among the media, among a lot of regular citizens that we've got to do more, we've got to do better in civic education. So a national movement has been born, and you have the opportunity to be part of it. We have the Civics Now coalition that is run by iCivics that has taken over much of what the campaign for the civic mission of schools. Mr. Hamilton, you'll remember that campaign, what it's been doing to forge a national movement, including state level affiliates. We published a guide for state and local policymakers on the necessary steps to improve policy so that civic learning can flourish for every single school child in the nation. Joseph has put that in the Dropbox. It's accessible to you. We also have in there write-ups of what other states have done to improve civic learning. One reason that so many people have become concerned about this issue in recent years are studies that are showing a decline in support for basic democracy and small d democratic ideals on the part of far too many of our young people. In 2011, the noted researchers Foy and Monk found that 24% of US millennials, then in their teens, early 20s, considered democracy to be a bad or very bad way of running the country. In January 2017, 35% of millennials in a Rasmussen study said that they were losing faith in American democracy, and just 25% were confident in the democratic system. In 2018, the Democracy Project surveyed 1,400 adults. When asked about the importance of democracy to American society, only 39% of young adults aged 29 and under said it was absolutely important. We see the record rates of not only the lack of civic knowledge, we all saw Jay Leno's jaywalking shows. Nobody could name a justice of the Supreme Court, but they all could name the justices on American Idol. We also see, though, this growing alienation potentially eroding our democracy itself unless young people receive the necessary instruction in this subject. Like I said, there's a national movement underway. There are a lot of resources available to you. I'd like to give you just a couple of pointers based on my experience in working in other states. One of the first activities we urge every state to do once you form a broadly inclusive task force, and hooray for you Hoosiers, you've done that, is survey on the ground, in the schools, frontline teachers, and if you can, parents and students, to find out the reality. Let me guarantee you it's going to be different than how people in Indianapolis see it up in Benton County, what happens there. So we urge you, do a benchmark survey of your frontline civics and social studies teachers to determine exactly the reality and what they say they need to do a better job there in Indiana. Second, administrators today, superintendents, school principals, are disincentivized from ensuring that their schools provide effective civic learning. They're graded on, their jobs are dependent upon test scores in math and English language arts, and to a lesser degree, science. That's a challenge you're going to have to work on there in Indiana, as every other state has to work on. Take a look at potential assessment opportunities, authentic opportunities in civic learning that you could institute there. Things like portfolio assessment, where a student produces a body of work that is judged. It's harder for teachers, but it's more authentic assessment than a paper pencil fill in the bubble test. Or look at a reward structure that somehow rewards school administrators for allowing their teachers to teach civic learning like we know their teachers want to teach them. Another thing you're going to be hearing about is a term called action civics. And this has become somewhat politicized around the country. Action civics, frankly, done right, is, and some of you know Project Citizen from the Center for Civic Education, action civics done right is simply a science laboratory type experience for students, where they determine an issue that's important to them. They do the research surrounding the issue, they come up with a recommendation, and as a comitative activity, as a assessment, if you will, they're judged on making that presentation either to a governmental body or to a group of teachers. These are things we shouldn't shy away from. Now I'm going to turn it back over to the governor to talk about my good friend Sean Healy, who's going to talk about more state specifics. But I want to leave you with a quote from Congressman Hamilton's good partner in civic education, my dear friend Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who has said from one end of this country to the other, knowledge of our rights and responsibilities as citizens is not passed down through the gene pool. It must be taught, and we've got a lot of work to do. And we, the national civic learning community and the Civics Now Coalition, stand ready to assist you there in Indiana in any way we can. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Ted. And Chuck, are there any questions from the audience members in the chat box?
Joseph, you've been monitoring that. Have any questions been typed in yet?
We currently have none right now.
And if there's anybody on the phone who would like to ask a question of Ted at this point, feel free to unmute, and we'll pause briefly for you to do that and see if you have any questions there. You'll have other opportunities as well as things come up, but if you have any for Ted right now, we'll be happy to entertain those. Okay, well, keep them coming, or keep thinking of them to have them coming. And I think, Governor, we'll go back to you. And if you want to move on to Sean, and we can maybe have other questions after that point as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chuck. And thank you again, Ted. That was inspirational, and it also gives us a perspective on the work that we have ahead of us. So thank you for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Sean Healy, who will expand on the national perspective on civic education. Dr. Healy leads the Robert R. McCormick Foundation Democracy Program, which seeks to strengthen democracy in Illinois. Sean has chaired the Illinois Task Force on Civic Education in 2014, so he is well educated on this specific topic. Remember, if you are on the computer for this meeting, please write your questions in the chat box. And if you're on the phone, we will be giving you notice afterwards so that you can ask your questions. Welcome, Dr. Healy.
Thank you. It's a real honor. Thank you, Governor, and it's a real honor to be joining you here today. I believe I have some slides, Joseph, if you could pull those up that I'd like.
Yep, right there.
Awesome to work off of today. So welcome from one state over. It's a real privilege to be here with you today, and it's a real honor to work with Ted nationally as we through the Civics Now Coalition try to support state-based efforts to strengthen civic education. So much of what I'm going to talk to you briefly about this morning is work that we've done in Illinois, but want to pick up where Ted left off in this national context, and specifically work that he led a team of us to create a policy menu for states I think it's really important to underline and highlight what Ted said, that local context matters so much, that states are laboratories of democracy with respect to this and other issues. And I think we've put together a really comprehensive policy menu that we see states like Indiana consulting and really determining what's the best course of action for them moving forward. So highly recommend that you look at that. If we could flip to the next slide, I just want to highlight a couple of efforts that inspired us and continue to inspire us in Illinois. So much of what we've been able to do, frankly, we've learned from other places. And I have to start with Florida because they really were our inspiration. And as frankly, we worked on policy in Illinois and simultaneously developed implementation plans. Florida was about 5 years ahead of us. And so I literally went down there and studied what they did. And the folks that led that effort, most prominently Dr. Doug Dobson out of the Lou Fry Institute at the University of Central Florida, have been so generous with their time. So highly recommend you look into what they did. Ted mentioned Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. She actually went down there and addressed both sessions of their legislature and produced this landmark legislation in 2010 called the Sandra Day O'Connor Civic Learning Act, put in place a middle school civics course requirement, which isn't revolutionary in its own right, but tied a high stakes test to that course. Most of the students take that test in 7th grade, but need to pass it to go on to high school. And the grade or the scores on that test actually factor into school grades. So there's a good debate, and Ted mentioned the importance of assessment. There's a good debate about how we assess civics. I can tell you just firsthand observations and going down to Florida, they test it, they teach it, and they care an awful lot about civics in Florida. So it's an important thing to look at. I also admire point 3 on this slide. They've incorporated civics content into the elementary grades, particularly through reading, through English language arts. So there's some real opportunities to do civics across the curriculum. And then also important, the state has appropriated money over time for things like curriculum development, analyzing test data. You see a screenshot of their most recent test results, which are definitely on the incline. And I would argue most importantly, teacher training, high quality teacher professional development is key. Like if there's one thing I would recommend that you do at scale is teacher professional development. Next slide, Joseph. More recently, and our story is kind of wedged in between these two stories, but the most recent success, and as I've looked at this policy in more detail, I think a policy that should be emulated in other states. Our friends in Massachusetts, you see the governor, Charlie Baker, signing this law in 2013. Massachusetts put forth its own middle school course requirement. And it's a comprehensive law that includes support for updated civics and history standards. That includes a middle school course, as mentioned in the headline here. Really innovative civics project trust fund, where the state is infusing some resources, but also foundations and corporate funders are contributing to. This is really key. I'll speak about what we've done in Illinois, but resourcing implementation is really key. Ideally, there's some public support. In Illinois, we didn't have that, so we had to raise all of our resources privately. But this trust fund, all of us in the field are really watching its evolution and really hopeful that it presents a model for emulation in other states. Related to that project trust fund and what Ted talked about with Action Civics is a middle and high school student project requirement. And then finally, it goes without saying that elections are teachable moments. It's a time where young people learn a lot about politics and get excited about elections. Massachusetts has put in place a high school voter challenge. So even a competition amongst high schools and their students and a lot of universities do this now, of course, to see, frankly, who can turn out the most voters. So I think a law that's definitely worthy of exploring further. As Ted said, the Civics Now website has done some deep dives on Florida, Massachusetts, and us in Illinois. So next slide, I'm going to turn to our work in Illinois and start in a place that I know you're starting in Indiana. You've done a couple of civic health indices, several, I think, but I know in particular, you've highlighted relatively low levels of voter participation in Indiana. We've done a handful of these civic health indices too, in collaboration with the National Conference on Citizenship. And what's interesting about Illinois is on a lot of measures of civic engagement, we're actually pretty average. We did our most recent index looked just at our young people. And we found also on a lot of measures, our young people were pretty average, but there were a couple that were deeply troubling to us, including our young people's tendency to not vote in local elections, to work in their communities with neighbors to solve problems, and frankly, even just norms of reciprocity amongst neighbors. On each of these measures, we were bottom 10 in the country. And I think it's a fair argument to say that our graduates are ill prepared for civic life. So that's been our basic frame. And I know that's where you're starting in Indiana, saying, hey, something's not right here. We think civic education is the long-term solution to some of the challenges plaguing our democracy here in Illinois. Next slide. So a program, and this is kind of where our story starts, and it goes back to some of the work that Ted has helped lead for a couple of decades. There was a publication of a report called The Civic Mission of Schools in 2003 that I know Representative Hamilton was part of in creating. In Illinois, we took those recommendations from that 2003 report and created something called the Democracy Schools Initiative. And the thought being that it's great if there is a civics class. As Ted said, until recently, we didn't have one, but we think civics is more than just a semester-long class. It's something that should be infused throughout students' P20 experience. We started with high schools and created really a program by which schools could assess the extent to which they're incorporating high-quality civic learning opportunities across the curriculum, in how the school itself functions through extracurricular activities. And it's a program that we've run since 2005 and now have scaled throughout our state. So you see the map of our state, certainly a really strong presence in the Chicago area where about 60% of our population lies, but then a strong presence downstate and throughout our highly diverse state demographically and geographically. And what I can tell you is there are some common features of what a school-wide commitment to civic learning looks like, but once again, they're super context dependent. What this allowed us to do is to demonstrate that civic education with the right supports can thrive in any context, and through effective state policy, we can do this everywhere. And I'll also say that these schools, the teachers and students and administrators at these schools proved our best advocates for state policy. So this was kind of our rank and file that ended up reaching out to individual state legislators, ended up reaching out to the governor, and affecting some pretty impressive change over the course of a decade or so. So that leads me to some of the policy work on the next slide. And the place that you're kicking off today, which was a task force on civic education, we created through statute in 2013 and convened throughout the spring of 2014, produced a report for our state legislature. I had the honor of chairing this task force. We then proceeded to do public hearings throughout the state, which I think you're planning to do also. That was really critical. One, in just getting feedback on our recommendations, and two, we actually got quite a bit of media attention around the state, and that helped set the stage for some of the things to follow. But pay attention to our recommendations here. We led with a course requirement. I know you have one of those in Indiana. We didn't. We also talked about revising our state standards, which focus pretty much on low-level content knowledge, where the rest of K-12 education had really moved to a focus on skills Not to say content isn't important, but they must operate in tandem. We talked about a project-based or service learning requirement, which we didn't also had. 4 and 5 talk about teachers, and that's, as I said, an underlying theme. Both pre-service teachers in the case of point 4, and professional development for in-service teachers in point 5. And then once again, the opportunity to involve young people in elections, which I'll end with in just a bit. Next slide. So we finish with these recommendations. We get to work immediately the next spring. Our number 1 requirement or recommendation, not by accident, was a course requirement. We got that law passed in 2015. Bipartisan support. We had a super majority of Democrats in the legislature, but the picture on the bottom there is a Republican governor, Bruce Rauner. We had a majority of both caucuses support this bill, so I'm really proud of that. We have the semester-long course. And the thing I think is most important, and Ted gave some attention to this, it's not just that we're teaching civics, but it's how we're teaching it. So there is the traditional direct instruction on government institutions, but we've also required discussions of current and controversial issues. One of the most impactful practices in developing students' knowledge, service learning, and simulations of democratic processes. So these are the so-called proven practices that are in some of these seminal reports that Ted has been responsible for disseminating and developing. Next slide. We also simultaneously develop new state standards through a teacher-led task force commissioned by our State Board of Education. They rely on this national framework that I understand Indiana has used also to revise your own standards called the College, Career, and Civic Life framework. So we had these 2 policies basically pass or be adopted in tandem, which was really important. Going on to the next slide, in supporting implementation. And implementation, as you all know, for policy is everything. We had to do this in a state which you probably hear a lot about, that has numerous fiscal challenges that preceded this pandemic. So going down to Springfield and asking for an unfunded mandate was really dangerous, right? We needed to go down there and say, here's how we're going to do implementation if you give us this new mandate. Here is the funded mandate, and that funding in our state has come through private sources. So the upper left part of the pie, the foundation community in Illinois, along with some corporate funders, provided the resources for implementation. We had to make this a statewide thing, so we've developed partnerships, mostly with colleges and universities throughout the state, to serve as sites for teacher training. We have Ted mentioned the MCFA Challenge. We have a robust community of civic education nonprofits in the Chicago area. Didn't have a lot of statewide reach. So through these institutional partnerships, we are able to achieve that, working with them. And then ultimately, we used a train the trainer model in recruiting veteran civics teachers, giving them extensive training, and then frankly, unleashing them to support teachers in schools and districts in their respective regions. So that's our basic model. Next slide. And we've been able to achieve some pretty impressive scale, I think. One thing we've tracked is just the number of teachers we've trained since this law's passage. We really started this in October 2015 in earnest, and we've touched now over 10,000 teachers, some of those more than once, and provided over 1,400 hours of professional development. So this to me is everything with respect to implementation. Next slide. The trainings themselves have had impact. So we have evaluated course implementation, one from the level of what impact our trainings are having on teachers, 2, what impact courses are having on students, and 3, the extent to which teachers, schools, and districts are implementing the law with fidelity. This is just a screenshot that shows teacher confidence or efficacy as a result of attending our trainings, focused on some of the requirements of the law, and we kicked off implementation in the context of another presidential cycle, teaching the 2016 election. But what you show is increasing confidence as a result, in this case, of attending 2-day trainings that we offered throughout Illinois in the summer of 2016. Next slide. As I mentioned, we have some early indication that the course is having a strong impact on students. I have to say, as a researcher, this was a really pleasant surprise. But what you see here is a difference on a number of civic engagement measurements that I think we all care about. Things like volunteering or serving in a group or organization or discussing politics, helping to make your city or town a better place to live. Some pretty impressive movement as a result of taking this course, as opposed to students who have not yet been exposed to the course. Next slide. Most recently, last spring, we went back down to Springfield and took care of what we consider some unfinished business. The legislator in the bottom of the slide, Camille Lilly, has long thought that high school was too late to start teaching about civics. So we got a middle school course requirement passed, this time with a Democratic governor signing it. Once again, strong bipartisan majorities, in fact, super majorities in favor of this. The law largely mirrors our high school law and takes effect this coming fall. And we've received indication that even in spite of the dislocation that's happening in K-12, we expect that to move forward for this coming fall. So we're once again in the field supporting implementation. Next slide. Click through, there's a couple pictures that are gonna pop up here. I'm gonna close with just the opportunity to engage young people in elections. And what we've done in Illinois, I'm really proud of this over the last decade, is frankly made it easier for young people to participate in elections. One of them being, if you're gonna be 18 by November, we allow those 17-year-olds to vote in primaries that precede that general election. And this was an effort, as you can see here, led by high school students at a school up in the northwest suburbs called Stevenson High School. Bipartisan support. Bottom picture is the governor signing the bill on the football field. Suffrage at 17 became the law in 2012. We have all kinds of evidence in primaries where young people are even outvoting their parents. 17-year-olds are outvoting their parents. Next slide. More recently, we joined about 10 other states in passing a law enabling automatic voter registration, which disproportionately helps young people. We've already brought about 700,000 new people onto the rolls in Illinois. We estimate that we'll get as high as 2 million once this law is fully implemented. You see here, once again, a Republican governor signing this law with bipartisan support. Next slide. And then finally, as we look to the fall, I think a couple of things I'd like to say about the fall, and once again, I know elections were a driver of this task force. One is we do vote by mail at probably a much more massive scale. Young people tend to benefit least from that, so I would encourage you to think of an explicit strategy to engage young people in light of the pandemic and its likely duration. And then two, we've long had a program in Illinois where young people can serve as election judges, juniors and seniors in high school. It's a paid position, but just a fantastic teachable moment, I can say, as an educator. And then two, once again, given the fact that I think we're gonna have this hybrid election, lots of people voting by mail, but still the need for polling locations, young people, frankly, are less vulnerable to this pandemic. Would be great to see them serving in this capacity at a broader scale. So that's the extent of my presentation. Would love to take any questions you might have, but once again, an honor to address you. And I stand ready here in my home today, but right next door in Illinois to assist you in any way I can with your important effort.
Thank you, Dr. Healy. Chuck, are there any questions?
I think we might have seen a couple come in. Joseph, did you have something you want to read? I need to unmute.
Yes, there is a couple questions, or it looks like one question that Ted has went forward and answered in the chat during Sean's presentation. Okay, for Dr. Healy, what is the level of resourcing that Florida used? How much did it cost them, and or what level of funding is expected for a successful program?
So that's probably tough to nail down, but I can speak to what Florida's done from the standpoint of appropriations. Ted, tell me if my recollection is about 750,000 a year. The state appropriation was
A little bit more than that. And here's the deal. It's become part of the regular education appropriations in the state of Florida. The expense to the state is administering the end of course test that's required by the Sandra Day O'Connor Act. Just as a state administers an end of course test in English, in math, in any other of the core subjects. So that is an additional cost burden. But again, either civic education is important to the future of our republic or it's not. It's an expense worth bearing. And I'd also like to point out the professional development in Florida. While there is some state funding for it, a lot of the professional development that's done by the Lou Fry Institute and the Florida Joint Center on Citizenship is like what Sean and company have been able to do in Illinois, funded by the private sector. There's room for the private sector to help the supplemental programmers and the state in providing effective professional development. So bottom line, what's the cost in Florida? A lot less than what they spend on assessment in reading and math.
Yeah, and then I'll say for Illinois, we viewed both the high school implementation, now the middle school implementation. Basically the dollar we've tried to raise about $1 million a year. And that includes the commitments of my foundation, $1 million a year over the course of 3 years. So we see this period of intensive support. And then as Ted mentioned about Florida, over time, you like to see the system itself pick that up and treat, frankly, the civics and the social studies the way we teach other subject areas. That's something that a school and a district attends to internally. But that's how you get to a place of sustainability. But I think there is a need over a certain period of time with new policies, or frankly, just to get teachers in the place they need to be with respect to high quality civic learning. There's a need for intensive supports. So we viewed that as now a series of 3-year windows.
And this is Chuck. Let me mention briefly, it seems like a good opportunity in Indiana. We're very fortunate to have the General Assembly support the We the People program, which includes a substantial professional development component. And we have a partnership. For the pandemic, we would be done this summer, bringing in scholars from around the country to train a lot of our teachers with professional development. And our next two speakers might be able to speak something to that, since they've both participated in that program as well as that professional development. So, and I will just echo what Ted and Sean have said. That to me is one of the most fundamental things that we can do to sort of maximize that impact on students. And so we're happy to be a part of that. And I just wanted to mention that the General Assembly support is crucial to that effort.
Any additional questions from members on the phone? Well, thank you, Dr. Healy. We appreciate the information, and certainly Illinois has set a good example for us. So we will, I'm sure, be working with you as we continue down this road. So thank you.
My pleasure, my honor.
Hey, our next speaker is Janet Chandler, who will be speaking on the Indiana perspective on civic education. Janet Chandler is a longtime social studies teacher and department chair at Hamilton Southeastern High School. She has been involved with the We the People program as well as mock trial. In addition, she is a current member of the board of directors for the Indiana Bar Foundation. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be asked to speak today, and I was asked to address what the current state is now in at the secondary level of schools, and then my colleague Molly will be addressing elementary after that. And so I have a short PowerPoint that Joseph is trying to get up for you right now. I'll go ahead and address a couple of things that Dr. Healy mentioned. In Indiana, we also allow 16 and 17-year-olds to work the polls as compensated workers. And we do allow 17-year-olds to vote as long as they're 18 by election day in November. And then Chuck had mentioned the We the People professional development, so I'll address that now. And both Molly and I have participated as mentors and participants in this, and this is an opportunity where teachers can come together and listen to scholars. It's at no cost to the teacher other than just their time, and it's been held the last few years in the summer over several days, and they also have an opportunity to create a work product for it. So Molly and I have served as mentors in that program in recent years. And so at the secondary level, you can go to the next slide, please, Joseph. I've spoken to middle school, junior high teachers. I had 1 year myself in teaching at that level, but I did not teach social studies. I'm also licensed in French, and I taught English on an emergency license back in the day. So a long, long time ago, I was in a middle school, junior high level. And so I talked to a number of teachers, and of course, the required class that has a very, very small civics component in it is 8th grade US history. And I would say small in the fact that from the standards perspective, it is basically just a historical look back on the country and the development of the country. And in 8th grade, that ends with around the 1900s. Unlike some other courses, social studies courses are very content specific. English courses are very process oriented, where it doesn't matter what content you use, whereas social studies classes are not that way. We are very much into the content. One particular junior high that I spoke to did a huge service project that I thought was a really good connection to the community. It's a 7th and 8th grade junior high. The 7th graders did service around the school, whereas the 8th graders got to travel within the community. And so it was a partnership with the city in addition to the school. And that speaks a bit to the service learning that Dr. Healy mentioned earlier, that I think would really be important for kids at younger grades. I also put the National Forensic League on there as something that happens now, because we have this speech competition which has components of civics related topics that kids can investigate and then speak on and do research on. And so I thought that was important to include that as an opportunity for junior high kids that also have that opportunity. And then of course, one of my great loves, the We the People program, I put up there as well. I think this is a great chance for kids to develop a true love of civics. And in the years that I've taught the program, I've never found anyone who didn't like it more than what they did when they started. This program at the junior high level divides kids up into 6 units of focus. And if they choose to compete at the state level, they can do so where they research particular questions and then respond to questions that they don't know ahead of time from a panel of judges. And so it simulates a congressional hearing standpoint where you have prepared testimony that you give, and then you're peppered with questions. And so it's really fun to see the kids' growth in this process. So for 7th graders at the junior high level, their focus is on world. And so 8th grade US history from the beginnings of this country up until 1900. And you'll find, from my standpoint away, it seems like a lot of time is spent on the development of the Constitution and a lot of time is spent on the Civil War. Like those are the 2 main focus areas. So next slide, please. And high school, again, there are, instead of just 1 course, from state standards, we have 3 courses that are offered. U.S. History, which is a 2-semester course, and it takes up, it's a small review from the beginnings of U.S. history compacted, and then it goes all the way to the present day. Again, a chronological type of order course. U.S. government is also required in Indiana. That's a 1-semester course, typically taken in senior year. U.S. history is typically taken in junior year, though there are exceptions to that. And then the General Assembly a few years ago mandated a course named Indiana Studies. That course also has a very small civics component in the standards. It is an elective course, though everyone's not taking it, whereas everyone is taking U.S. history and U.S. government. In the Indiana Studies course, the small strand is focused on the development and present day Indiana Constitution, as well as elections in Indiana. And then there's a small portion about federal elections as well. But the focus there of that course is on Indiana. I teach at a large comprehensive high school. We have around 3,400 students. And since the class has been required to be offered, we've never been able to have enough students who've signed up for it for us to offer it. As far as extracurricular or co-curricular types of activities that exist at the secondary level, again, I put the speech and debate forensics up there as a way that students can take their love of speaking or arguing or debating, and then focus on certain topics that do have that civics connection. The We the People program, of which I'm a part of, and have been ever since we've had it at our school and at some level of participation. I'm currently the teacher of it now. Works the same way as the junior high program does. And because we do compete, we offer that first semester. So the kids are taking a government class along with the We the People content. And then I also participate for a long time in the mock trial competition. We've been very fortunate that our county has had a competition since 2001. And then we have participated in the state competition since about 2005 or 6. And so that's another venue, where kids can learn about law and have a little bit of fun acting as well. I also put service up there because I feel that, some classes do service projects to connect to the community. We offer a sociology class, and our sociology class does do that and require service hours from kids to be able to make that community connection. And then my last slide is questions that you may have. I particularly like the question marks. I thought they were pretty. So any questions that I can address for you, I'd be glad to do so. Again, I was asked to specifically talk about what exists now. And then one thing that I should mention is the test. And that was just recently passed by the General Assembly. It took effect this year, in that high schools are required to give the naturalization test. It's 100 questions, and it is like there are some true false questions on it and some fill in the blank type of questions.
Okay, well,
Thank you, Jen. Go ahead, Chuck.
Oh, that was just me, Joseph. I was just reading a question out from the chat here that says, hello, curious on the educator thoughts on the new Indiana code provision, including the naturalization exam and history / I would assume government courses, and the new requirement from SEA 398 that the results of those passage rates be posted on the IDOE website.
All right. Well, this question asked for my opinion as an educator, and so I'll give it. I disagree with the test. I give it. To my knowledge, we have not been asked anything about posting anything on the DOE website. I've never been asked for my results of the test. I feel that the test is a rote memorization type of test, and to me, that's not what this is. Like, you want someone not just to be able to recite facts, but you want them to live civics. You want it to be in their DNA. And so I feel that we as teachers have a responsibility to instill that in our students, and through participation in government type of activities, not necessarily in taking a test. And my apologies to Representative Cook, who's on this call.
Any additional questions?
If I may, Governor, jump in, and Janet brilliantly, beautifully, and succinctly described the problem the educator community has with this particular initiative. And Representative, my apologies to you too. I've worked with the Joe Foss Institute for many years now. They're wonderful people. They have a sincere interest in improving civic education, and I love them for that. They're the people who were behind this initiative nationally. Here's the deal though, as Janet pointed out, it's dry rote memorization. In a vast majority of places, teachers have to stop their planned lessons and drill and kill the kids on the questions. And in many states, it's just 10 out of the 100 questions that are selected. Drill and kill the kids so they can spit back up the answers on that test. And then the kids forget the information that they were drilled and killed on. It sounds like a great idea, but it is not authentic assessment in civic learning. Thank you.
And let me just kind of piggyback on that. I know there are more questions coming for me, kind of appeared, but one of the things that teachers have been asked to do within the last, especially the last 5 years, is to change instruction. And probably when many of you were in school, it was the teacher giving information, and then you wrote it down because you were all good students, I'm sure. And then you gave that information back then on some type of test. Today's teaching isn't that way as much anymore. Instead, it's all about discovery and how we're supposed to kind of be the guide as opposed to the sage on the stage. And so like helping students learn research skills, helping students learn to do different types of inquiry activities, and not just us providing all the answers. And so I think that kind of plays into this, because our evaluations are based upon how well we help students engage in inquiry, not how well we pour information in. And so I know there's some questions, Joseph.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have two more, beginning with Liz Osborne. Janet, do you know how many schools are actually having Indiana Studies courses?
I do not know that. I mean, all schools have to offer the course, which we do. And we actually, one of my teachers had created an Indiana history course before the mandate came down, and we had successfully offered that. And then we changed it to Indiana Studies because it seemed somewhat duplicative. And then since it's been Indiana Studies, no one has signed up for it, or not enough to merit offering it. We have maybe like a few people, that would sign up, and we made it grades 9 through 12, open to all grades. And so I have no idea how many across the state. Perhaps that's a good question for the Indiana Council for the Social Studies to find out. But there are certainly lots of resources available from the state for that particular course.
Okay, and from Bill Moreau, we have, respectfully, doesn't rote memorization at least ensure we are working with a common set of facts while we debate the larger policy issues?
Well, I think we can all agree that the facts are the facts. That's true, that there are a common set of facts, and like the true education comes in how you think about those facts and what kind of action you take as a citizen to make it better. And so I realize that perhaps I'm in the minority, that about my disagreement with the rote memorization test, but that's where I am.
No, you're not, Janet. Psychometricians will tell you. And
Janet, this is Tony Cook. May I comment? Hi, Janet.
Hello.
We've known each other for a long time.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with you about the rote cognitive. It kind of circled around the fact that what's test gets taught sometimes is what kind of drove that, I think. But a question about the middle school in Illinois, when he presented the fact that they have a high stakes test in 7th grade. How do you feel about that? You know, one of the things that I advocated was to do things sooner too in middle school and take advantage of that. When I was in middle school, we had a civics class that was required in Indiana at that point. It basically structured Indiana history, but it also incorporated the federal, the state systems. How do you feel about all that?
Well, I guess we typically don't do high stakes in middle school. And it's kind of like what happens? Do you keep them in middle school if they don't pass it?
Sure.
You know, because, you know, we retain very few students, even at the elementary level. It's a huge process to go through because I think the education pedagogy right now is that, you know, that's so damaging emotionally for kids to be outside of their peer group. And we certainly don't want kids driving perhaps in middle school, you know. And so I think that would become the issue, like what happens in a middle school if it's high stakes. You know, like currently there isn't any testing in Indiana, but currently the proposed testing in Indiana was just, you know, to inform scores and, you know, to inform educators perhaps of weak areas where, you know, kids could be lifted up. But there's, you know, if they didn't do a certain score, if they didn't make the cut score, there was no penalty for them.
Thanks, Janet.
You're welcome.
Okay, and we also have a comment from Sean, which I can read aloud for the people tuning in on the phone. I suggest that the facts are so thin, i.e. the colors of the flag, that the test has the effect on minimizing civic education and thus undermining collective civic knowledge.
Any additional questions?
Just a comment, and maybe Dr. Healy can weigh in on this too. Having been a former principal for 30-some years and a superintendent of schools, I had a little question here early on back, I think it was before you even spoke, about the competition actually between teachers and classes. How do you get around that? You know, in high school and everything, everyone's jockeying for, and I think Janet can relate to this, an elective. We all want to sell our own thing, and I taught government and econ, and I really tried to recruit kids and wanted people in some of the elective offerings that we did float that depended on the number signing up. I can see that being an issue as you add in civics required courses at different levels. What gives, you know, so that happens, or is it a diverse incorporation of those classes within various other subject areas?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry about that. Thank you for that question. That's certainly something that we heard, particularly as we advocated for the high school requirement. I would say it was disruptive of electives for social studies electives. But I guess I would start from the standpoint where Ted McConnell began his comments, that we literally created schools for the purpose of preparing young people for democracy. I realize that you go down the list in arts education and health, everybody's got a good claim on what we do in schools. But to me, we need to be big and bold about the fact that it's not asking a lot to have at least a semester, if not a year of civics in high school. That's literally why we started doing public education in this country, was to prepare young people for democracy. And we've so marginalized that founding mission. So that's one place where I'm comfortable being big and bold and saying, hey, I'm okay with some extracurriculars being crowded out. I think everybody, I agree with the sentiments that everybody needs a common set of civic knowledge and civic experiences. And I have a hard time seeing how we do that without a required course.
Any additional questions?
I don't think we have any, Governor.
All right. Well, thank you, Janet, and thank you for your service in preparing our young Hoosiers for leadership and for the future. We truly appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
Our last presenter of the day is Molly Bowman, a 5th grade teacher at Eel River Elementary School. Molly has been teaching for 15 years at the elementary level and 11 years of We the People program to 5th graders. Molly, we appreciate your dedication to our students and look forward to hearing your perspective on Indiana civic education. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. I was looking forward to being there in person, but this has been quite an experience in moving everything to the digital world. Joseph, if you could go to my second slide, the first one with content, that would be great. I thought there was a common PowerPoint, so I apologize that I don't have a fancy cover page for you. My task today was to address the state of civic education at the elementary level in Indiana. And when you look at the standards, which is what guides our instruction, civics education should start in kindergarten with 4 civics related standards, but social studies standards totaling 19. You can see the increase as the grade levels progress, so that by 5th grade, 25 of their 54 standards are related to civics. 5th grade does happen to be the year that social studies is tested. So in my personal classroom, I spend a ton of time on social studies. It's also my passion. I consider myself to be a civics nerd. So I know my students are receiving civics education, and I wanted to give you a better perspective. I created a survey and sent it out to teachers that I know across the state, and tried to get it into as many hands as possible. I had about 30 responses that were relatively equally spread between kindergarten and 6th grade, since some 6th grade classrooms are in the elementary school. I learned that while 90% of those 30 teachers enjoy teaching social studies, 63% teach the subject 2 days a week or fewer, with almost 27% teaching it when they can fit it in. For those of you not familiar with the elementary classroom setting, fitting it in could mean anything from 5 minutes here and there throughout the week to 15 minutes once a month. In a day-to-day sense, that means that students in our state who are in grades K through 6 are ranging from integrated but barely explicitly taught to 225 minutes a week of social studies education. And I think that that disparity causes some of the issues that arise when they get to junior high and high school, that they just don't have that strong background. In a day-to-day sense, it would seem that this is a problem. So I also asked the teachers to respond about some things that make teaching social studies difficult or easy for them. And Joseph, if you want to go to the next slide. I'm giving you all of the standards in the major subject areas for all of the grades to look at, so that you can see why teachers are commenting that there's not enough time in the day to fit in social studies into the curriculum. The most heavily tested areas obviously are the ELA and math. In elementary school, testing in both of those areas starts in 3rd grade. So the focus of the K2, which we call the primary grades education, is on teaching students how to read. In kindergarten, those 63 ELA standards range from recognized letters to understanding that they have sound relationships, and then get them to reading by the end of the year. As a 5th grade teacher, that sounds like an incredible task to me, because the students I get can already read. But some of these students are entering with no understanding of anything outside of their small home world. So when these teachers are trying to teach large concepts like we live in the country called the United States and we have a president, some of these children can't conceptualize what that means. The kindergarten teachers I surveyed did say the kids are excited to learn about it and want to learn about it. That was the response at almost every level, but the time is an issue. If you go to that next slide, Joseph, this is why timing is such a big problem. I contacted a few of my first grade teacher friends to see why they were having so much trouble fitting social studies instruction into the day. And this is kind of a breakdown of what they do. So during a morning meeting, they will spend 30 minutes on skill review. It involves counting, calendar skills, counting by 2s, 5s, and 10s, some basic letter sound review. That's about 30 minutes. Throughout the day, they will spend 2 full hours on reading instruction, 45 minutes on writing, and she did say that could go up to 60 minutes from time to time, depending what they were doing. In those 45 minutes, that's not just learning your writing skills, but literally how to form the letters correctly. A special class would be your art, music, PE that takes up 30 minutes. Lunch is 45, and little ones need a recess. That's 360 minutes. And an average day, school day in Indiana is about 406 minutes. So that leaves 46 minutes for social studies, science, bathroom breaks, and transition times. If any of you have seen a first grade class take a trip to the bathroom, that would cut into those 45 minutes quite quickly. At the older grade levels, time is still a factor. I don't really have more slides if you want to take those down. The older grades, time is a larger factor, but not because of the minutes in the day. It's more because of the content that's presented. So in 4th grade, the time frame that they span in their 49 standards spans from 1000 BC to present day. In 5th grade, our 54 standards span 12,000 years from the crossing of the land bridge to the year 1800. So all of the teachers that I surveyed said, we would love to teach it, but there's so much content that we can't spend too much time on any one thing. In addition to that, materials seemed to be an issue. It was the main concern of teachers. They said, we like social studies, the kids like it, we want to do it, but it needs to be hands-on. At my current level in 5th grade, we're participating in the We the People program. It's readable for about half of my kids on their own, but the concepts and words are tricky, even for 5th graders. At the younger levels, they can't read on their own, so teachers are saying we need hands-on materials, maps, pictures, manipulatives, videos of people in the community doing different jobs and services so we can understand, the kids can actually understand what it means to be a citizen in a community, because they're really their only experiences with the adults that they have contact with. Teachers are looking. We're trying to find outside materials that make lessons more engaging, but are hoping that everyone that replied said that a decreased stress on testing in the ELA and math, they feel would open up more opportunity to have the science and social studies at the younger levels. From my personal perspective, having done this for 15 years, I will tell you that teaching civics is exciting. When my 5th graders participate in the We the People program, they are told on day 1, you are allowed to have whatever opinion you want, as long as you have a reason to back it up. And your reason can't be because I said so, or because I think so. You need evidence. And they love it. We will have debates and they are able to voice their opinions. And I get students who come to me and say, social studies is boring and I hate everything about it, who leave me wanting and looking forward to their 8th grade We the People class and emailing me and saying, we had We the People hearings today when they're 8th graders. And, we get to go to state, but it's all, I'm so excited that I did it in 5th grade too. I think they want the civics, but when you have a teacher who's untrained in these programs, it can also be difficult. Anecdotally, I currently teach on a team of 3 teachers. When our building opened, I taught We the People to all 90 5th graders rather than just my own class of 30. The other teachers watched me as kind of a training for about 3 years before we we moved to teaching it in our own classrooms. And the year that we moved to our own classrooms, one of the other teachers came to me and he said, I'm really nervous. I don't feel like I know enough about this to present it to my students. And I, being supportive, I was like, you're going to be great. And he said, okay, but first, can you explain to me the difference between a Republican and a Democrat? And I tried to go very basic and said, one tends to be conservative and one tends to be liberal. And he said, okay, what does that mean? And I think that is even more concerning than what we're giving to the students, is that in order to make the civic education beneficial to those children, the teachers need a larger base of knowledge, I think. Other than getting the teacher who wears the Constitution and has a passion for it, if you get one who just doesn't really know, you're going to have very different outcomes even in the same building. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. And if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Other questions? Chuck?
We do have, I believe General Zeller had something that he wanted to pose to the group, so I can call on you, General Zeller, if you have your question ready. Let me go ahead and read it. I would like to know when the understanding of federalism is taught so the other sovereign role is understood to avoid the monolithic government with only a focus on the United States government. He didn't address it to anyone in particular, so any of the teachers or
is that in the chat? Can I read it?
It was he sent it individually to me,
Okay.
so it wouldn't be available to everybody else to see necessarily. But that's essentially when is federalism taught, maybe for you and Janet, to answer that.
I can address that. I know that the word federalism is presented to my students in 5th grade through the We the People program. If you are using the textbook that our district adopted just for social studies, federalism is not mentioned as a term. The concept is there, but it's not identified by name. So realistically, if you pose that question to a group of elementary teachers, they may not be answering it factually, because they may not know that they're teaching that concept because it's not named in the textbooks.
And I would say that this is Janet again, at the high school level, federalism is mentioned both in U.S. history and government. I think that is a term that students often confuse with separation of powers. I think though even really good students will get those confused at times. In fact, I had in a Zoom session yesterday with some of my high flyers, I had to explain yet again, somebody misused the term. It's not explained specifically in 8th grade, but again, the concept is there. It's just not referred to as federalism.
Thank you, Joseph. Were there any other questions that you were sent?
From the chat, not a question, but a comment from Ted McConnell, in which he says, civics is highly integrative, can be taught effectively through English and other subjects. Florida has just developed and released a mandated grade-by-grade reading list of civics content. And then we have Stephanie Serriere commenting that federalism is in the 5th grade state as standards under civics. Just for those people on the phone that are unable to read the chat.
May I address the civics being taught through literacy, especially? I do know at the elementary school level, when teachers in K2 are teaching a lot of these topics, they're finding stories and books and things to use. The Center for Civic Education has a program called Foundations of Democracy that I was fortunate enough to use with my students when I taught 2nd grade. And it's very storybook based. You get one of those large, easel size books that you read the story and explore the concepts. But I still feel like there are teachers in schools who would read a book. The anniversary of the Titanic was yesterday. They would read a book about the Titanic and say, that was social studies today. So I do think that if we look at tying it into the literacy, there may still need to be like a professional development opportunity to show how reading a book isn't the civics education. It's exploring the content as well as just reading the story.
Are there any other questions on the phone? Okay, Governor Crouch, I think we're up to date on all the questions from this period.
Thank you, Chuck. And Molly, thank you for your presentation and your service to our young people. We appreciate it so much. Let's see here. We want to thank all of our presenters today. We appreciate your time, your dedication, and your flexibility as we have had to move this meeting to a virtual forum. But I think we've all done pretty well considering. Next, we'd like to review the goals and topics for future meetings. And our goal for this task force is to create a report for the General Assembly that focuses on the topic at hand. And we want to encourage our legislators and key stakeholders to improve our civic engagement across the state, whether that be with policy, legislative initiatives, or educational tools. And Chuck, would you like to expand on this and allow the task force to comment?
Thank you. Yes. So we also want to hear from you. Are there specific areas and topics that you want to make sure we include during this process? If people would like to discuss or mention those now, it would be certainly appropriate. If you would prefer to send those to Joseph or me offline, we're happy to include that as well. Again, we're going to be looking at state resources, at national resources and initiatives, and Ted and Sean have done a really good job of talking about some of those. So if there are any areas there that have sparked your interest and you want to make sure we pursue and follow in more detail, certainly let us know. And I think really that's kind of what we're looking for at this point, for you to let us know if there are specifics that you want us to make sure we include in future task force meetings. We'll have opportunities, as Governor Crouch said, to hear from local communities, and we fully expect to and anticipate getting good information that way as well. So really that's, I think, what I wanted to cover is if you have information, topics that you want us to make sure that we include in this process, feel free to let us know.
Thank you, Chuck. And to start working on the final report, we have created some committees that you are welcome to join. We understand everyone is extremely busy, so we're making those committee assignments optional. But feel free to volunteer your staff on a committee if you think it is something you or your office can provide some insight on. And Chuck, would you like to expand upon the committee topics for our members?
Sure. We decided to sort of keep it fairly broad at this point, and let some of these, sort of directions continue to evolve and look in these categories. But we've essentially broken it down to policy committee, research committee, and the outreach committee. One of the things, again, we're hoping to do is, and when we say outreach, it's not just for the public and media consumption, although those certainly, if you have connections and expertise or things that we want to make sure to include and folks that we want to include from that perspective, we would appreciate it. But it's also outreach around the state to local communities and local teachers, local people that are interested in these topics, so that we can really have a comprehensive and thorough analysis of this in Indiana. So again, as Governor Crouch said, it's by all means not a mandatory thing, and we appreciate anybody who's interested in working with us on a more detailed basis. That is not an expectation necessarily for being on the task force, but we wanted to give that opportunity for those of you that want to sort of join at that level as well. So I would just encourage you to make yourselves known to Joseph or me, and we can coordinate and work with you as we move through these next few months.
Well, thank you, Chuck, and thank you, Joseph. You all have put in hours to make this all possible. We appreciate your dedication. And also, I'd like to thank Taylor Hollenbeck from the Lieutenant Governor's Office. She's also worked very hard on my behalf. We are not live streaming our meeting today, so there won't be a public forum that we have listed on the agenda. And we're hoping that we will have our next meeting in a live setting and we'll be able to allow public comments. But this meeting is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the Indiana Bar Foundation's website. At this time, are there any comments, questions, or thoughts about today's meeting from our task force members? If not, we want to thank our speakers for joining and educating us today. And we have taken notes and we use this information to prepare our final report. If there's nothing left to cover or discuss, I will entertain a motion to adjourn this task force meeting.
So moved.
And is there a second?
I'll second that.
Perfect. Well, thank you all. We stand adjourned. Thank you for joining us. We will be sending our next meeting details shortly. Be healthy, be safe. We're all in this together. Thank you, and God bless you.